profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. Oh my goodness. I want to begin by just looking around. As far as I can tell, most of the people that I know who are regulars are in their homes. For those who are not in Sonoma County, we are, although actually for those in other parts of California, I know there's also wildfires all over. In Sonoma County, we're having our 4th annual great taxing of the nervous system, where we're all wondering if we'll have to leave our homes at any minute. I'm pretty sure all of us have bags packed and our lives are kind of dependent on that, literally on the changing of the winds. And it's just so intense. It's I'm just so struck by how activating it is for the nervous system. I see it in myself, I see it in my kids, I see it in our animals, just the light that's impacted by the smoke and the smell of the particulate in the air is just so, there's such a natural human response to be like, and then we have to get reasonable as adults and prepare. And just amazing to me that we have this uncertainty on top of all the other uncertainties. And I, for one, am extremely grateful for practice in the midst of it. And just to return into the body and exist a little bit, in the midst of the chaos and the agitation. So today I have a talk, it's shifted a little bit given the burdens on our nervous systems. But I want to talk today about calling in, which is the opposite of calling out. So the Sanghic practice of calling in. And before I do that, though, I want to just invite us to come into our bodies and settle and really take a few minutes, if it helps, to close your eyes and not have to be in the visual field of Zoom. Please do. And just arrive in the body and just notice what is here in the physical body for each of us today. And whatever there is, particularly if there's activation or agitation, but really whatever is arriving, I just want to offer the invitation to breathe in what is uncomfortable and breathe out presence and ease. Breathing in what is painful and breathing out a joyful presence. Breathing in resistance. Breathing out arriving. And even though in Zen we don't, it's not typical in Zen to offer lots of technique. This utilization of the breath is available to us all the time as human beings, and I just encourage us to know that it is meditation. It bears the fruits of meditation, and it's ours to enjoy and engage. And the second thing I'd like to do before I start talking about calling in is, well, it's related. I'd like to try an experiment, and I hope you'll join me in it. It's a practice, because in Zen, actually, we have the practice of chanting together. You know, ceremonies and service where we chant together and we use our voices together is a kind of, you know, there's lots of reasons for it. There are historical reasons, and there are reasons for it in terms of our practice life of offering merit and calling on intervention and calling on protection, keeping the sutras alive. But there's also the effect of harmonizing and regulating our bodies collectively, and actually expressing the Sangha body as a collective, expressing the voice of the Sangha. And it's an enactment of Sangha as one body. And we don't get to do that very much in this Zoom situation that we're currently in. So I wanted to try an experiment of just humming together. And I'll time it. It won't go on for long if it's very agitating to you. Or you can mute your computer, I guess, if it's very agitating. What I would like to see if we can do is I'll offer a tone, and then we all unmute, and I'll even have my timer. And just for a minute, we'll hum together. And you can decide whether you want to just meet the same tone, or if you want to harmonize. It's up to you. Okay? All right. Let me start this. Okay, so unmute if you'd like. We can remute just for the sake of background looping. That was fun. I put my view on speaker view so it would pop around. Thank you. Was it disturbing to anyone? Be honest, because I might try it in other places. You know? Oh my goodness, I miss being in expressed voices with other people. I miss singing, and I miss chanting, and I miss the kind of the soul nourishment of that. So thank you for trying that with me, with us as a Sangha. That exercise was inspired by there's one of many that's offered in a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, which is a book about trauma, racism and trauma in the body. And it's a profoundly beautiful book, and for me, and it's naming things that I've felt and kind of had an inkling of, but it's naming them in ways that I'm like, oh, it's so relieving to have somebody who has studied this so deeply name this in the ways that Resmaa Menakem does. And I want to acknowledge there's the limitation of the book is that he particularly focuses on, he's African American, he in fact focuses on white bodies, Black bodies, and police bodies, and the trauma of race and bodies in those three categories. So the the downside of that is that it leaves out, I'm just the people who are on mute. It leaves out the experience of people that don't follow those categories, which is many, many people, you know. And still, there's something really profound for me in the offering that he's making, and he gives lots of exercises throughout the whole book of engage with the trauma. So what the great offering of that book is about, working with race and racial conditioning and the trauma in the body, including on white people, of racialization and racial inequity and violence, and how to address that in the body, in the individual, you know, as a way, and this is super important because you could feel that it's his life work, as a way to address that interpersonally in our communities, in our country, and just in the wider world. So he comes from that vantage point. And this in itself, this book is a beautiful calling in, invitation into working with racial trauma, and including the, you know, not so frequently named part of how white people are traumatized, even, and maybe mostly when we are perpetrators of violence, both physical and psychological. The way that even when you are in a place of advantage in a hierarchy, you are harmed by the dehumanization that happens with something as divisive as racism and racial inequity. So I appreciate that he's forging that terror into how everybody can heal. I know I've mentioned this before, there's a quote attributed, well, actually, I think it's a calligraphy that was done by Thich Nhat Hanh that says, the next Buddha will be Sangha. And I know I've mentioned that at Stone Creek before. So the next Buddha will be Sangha, meaning the next, you know, incarnation of Buddha in this world will actually be not a singular being, but the Sangha being, the Sangha body. Well, actually, I don't know what he meant, but that's how I hear it. And I read that quote in an article by Sebene Salesi called Sangha Is a Verb. And I think it might have been a presentation she gave at Sakyadhita, which is a gathering of Buddhist women, international Buddhist women. Sangha, so Sangha as a practice, as an engagement, not as a thing, or not even as a noun. Sangha is a verb. And I've been thinking about how Sanghas, you know, Sangha in all of its definitions are places of refuge where the possibility for liberation is being taken up by everybody together. Doesn't mean we are good at it, doesn't mean we achieve it. It just means that we come, when we come together in Sangha, we're coming together with the intention of taking up liberation. And that makes for a different culture. It's a different cultural entity. And then for me, Sanghas are places of refuge in the world, no matter how complicated and flawed, because they're places where we can risk to be in conversation with one another. We can know that the other people that are coming there are also seeking liberation, and we can do things differently than we do in other cultures. Try to engage with one another differently than from the habit energy of dominant culture, certainly, and also of all the other cultures that we inhabit. Sanghas are also always, like by definition, collections of human beings and everything that means. So that when groups of human beings gather together in any form, all of us are there, whether we like that or not. You know, our wisdom is there, our good intentions are there. In Stone Creek, a defining feature for me is the warmth and the kindness that is there. So it's a warm-hearted Sangha generally. There's a real intention to be tender with each other and kind. but also, and, or maybe not, but, and also what's there are our injuries. There are our traumas, the things that we carry around that are unresolved. The whole of our psyches are there. Our confusion, our delusion, the ways we've been hurt, our anger. That's always there in Sangha. So when we take those parts together, the complexity of what it means to be human and the deep intention to be and act together in liberation, it becomes, for me, it becomes super clear that like how we engage with one another is it, that's it. That is the road and the point of practice. It is the place where practice really manifests. When Sebene Salesi was describing this in her article, Sangha is a Verb, she said, and this was from a few years ago, she was saying, Sangha as a refuge is not well integrated. Yes, it's often referenced as a third jewel, and yes, it does exist in time and space as a functional process to keep our communities running. Like many Dharma centers, New York Insight Meditation, which is my home Sangha, where I work full-time, is an active center with many offerings, and we rely on a multitude of wonderful Sangha members and volunteers to exist. But mostly, we do not actively, formally practice Sangha as relating. There's a strong emphasis on personal awakening through individual study and practice, even if it's done in large rooms together with other practitioners. There's a lack of emphasis on and even avoidance of relating to others, especially about differences, and especially when those differences challenge our ideas of what practice looks like. I believe if we aspire to cultivate welcoming and inclusive sanghas, we must introduce practices and processes to engage and explore our differences and our similarities. So she was talking about Sangha as a verb in terms of the ways that at New York Insight Meditation Center, how they've cultivated a culture around inclusivity and working with differences, particularly around race, but of all kinds of cultural differences and societally imposed differences. And I want to acknowledge that, relating to one another currently in times of pandemic, it's definitely strained, relating to one another in times of evacuations, definitely strains our capacity to be together. And as Buddhist practitioners, we're also always in Sangha. So we can always kind of understand that we're in the Sangha of humanity. And we can take the things that we strive together explicitly in Zen Buddhist Sangha and apply that to our whole life and every interactions all the interactions that we have. This practice of calling in versus calling out. Do people know? So calling out is like when you're called out for something. Somebody calls you out on something that you've done wrong. Probably universally not a pleasant human experience, but sometimes necessary. Sometimes we welcome it. Sometimes we don't. And I feel like it's the expression of what it means to hold one another accountable. I'm going to call them out on this. The problem with calling out, first of all, I think, is that it is that thing. It's rooted in, I think it's actually rooted in division and separation. And because of that, it's an unpleasant experience, Although I can say I have been called in on a number of occasions where I'm not enjoying the situation. I'm uncomfortable, but if there's enough ground of trust and relationship and practice is present, I'm willing in a way that is quite different when someone's calling me out in a way that is separating, if that makes sense. There are two features I often think a lot about dominant white culture and the ways that it shapes, well, really everyone in the United States, whether we're white or not. Dominant white culture has a big impact. It's like you can argue that that dominant culture is white culture, and it impacts us differently depending on our racial identity, and it's still impacting all of us in some way or another. And there are different features that that scholars are working to identify and have been for many years. What are the features of this culture? There's a great list of these that I don't have with me, but it includes like always being on time and the elevation of the written word and suppression of emotion, these kind of things that are probably familiar to many of us as dominant culture agreements. There's two that I think are super challenging in terms of our interpersonal connections and in terms of trying to engage the practice of calling in. The first one is a somewhat constant feeling of competition or measuring or hierarchy that is rooted in individualism. So in the delusion of being separate, when we engage with one another, there's often, especially if we're really steeped in dominant culture, there's often a kind of establishing of who's up and who's down, and a wanting to win or lose. Sometimes we're invested in losing. And there's also a strong cultural value that I can see that really came through for myself. It came through education of being right, and knowing stuff. Oh yeah, I know that. Yeah, I haven't been able to curb it much yet, but I can see how often I'm in conversations with people and they're mentioning something like a thing that they've discovered. I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Like, why is it so reflex to say, oh yeah, I know, versus like, oh, that's wonderful that you found this thing. It doesn't matter if I know or not. And I was in this contemplation and I read a Facebook post by Zenju Earthlyn Manuel that said, this was her whole post. Any notions of feeling superior or inferior than anyone is to add to the poison of our times. I test myself always. Any notions of feeling superior or inferior than anyone is to add to the poison of times. I test myself always. So I feel like this is her expression of this practice of watching and attending all the time to the delusion of separation. And we can think that it's only when we're putting people down that we're separating, but it's even when we're elevating people that we're also enacting the delusion of separation. So in Sangha, which again, like we could take as Stone Creek, or we could take as Buddhist in communities of Buddhist practitioners, or we could take as in our whole lives. When something is challenging, it's very important for us to attend closely to what we do, even if it's all internal. And one of the things that I have found super helpful and I want to offer is it really helps to ground in the body and notice what's happening. Somebody says something agitating or irritating, or even I disagree with it, or whatever it is, like, if possible, pause, breathe, ground in the body and notice what happened just there. What was the somatic experience of, I disagree with you? No. and watch, because for me anyway, the habit body, the habit body, by body, I don't even mean my somatic response. I mean, my whole body mind is rooted in the delusion of individualism that I've been steeped in as a human being in my cultures, in the various cultures I've been in. The impulse is separation. I'm right and they're wrong. That's like, so when we notice that thought in our head, oh, that person's wrong, we've made ourselves right and we've separated. So we're falling into the habit energy of disconnection. And there's a kind of tension there. And I would say, in terms of our Buddha nature, the tension that's there is because we are now out of sync with reality, actually. We're trying to yank ourselves out of the fabric of reality where we're connected to everything. And we're like, no, I'm not connected to that thing. So this is really, I want to be super careful to say, there are oftentimes when we have to draw clear boundaries with harmful action. And that's different than the delusion of separation. Clear boundaries, and I think I have talked about that before, but that probably could merit its own Dharma talk. Clear boundaries are a beautiful expression of a relationship. Boundaries acknowledge a relationship, and that's where they come, when they're good and they're healthy, that's where they come from. But this is separation that I'm talking about, and it's often habitual, it's often acculturated. It's a norm, I would say in my world, it's a normal thing to do. When you disagree with somebody, you separate them. That impulse to just separate and be like, and to relieve the tension. So there's a feeling of agitation. There's that tension that goes with it. I want to relieve that agitation. I name it as that person being wrong and me being right. And I might not even name me being right, even though I've kind of done that when I say that person's wrong. Then I'm trying to relieve that tension by that little, like poof, they're wrong, poof. I off-gassed a little bit of that tension. And in the short term, it may be satisfying. So I was thinking about how it's a kind of addiction. There is a kind of addiction to delusion that we keep choosing over and over again, just like any kind of addiction where we choose the thing that ultimately is going to harm us, but we just can't help ourselves because right in that moment, it's going to give us some relief. That's number one. And number two, it's known. Someone who is in the world of recovery said to me lately that they have heard is the opposite of addiction is connection. I was like, oh, that's so applicable to Buddhism. The opposite of addiction is connection. And in this case, it's a kind of an addictive quality of negative karma that we're working with if we want to. So we have to pay close attention. And this might seem like, I'm just, I don't know, talking about like something that would happen in a process group or something, but this is really Buddhism. It comes in various of our precepts actually point to this kind of practice where we're paying close attention to what happens when we're in any kind of conflict with another person. The precepts that look at speech, I vow not to lie. So lying, there's the obvious lying, but there's also the lying about how we are connected to other beings that we often do when we are enacting separation. I vow not to slander. When we say that other person's just bad and wrong, that's slander in its essence. And I vow not to praise self at the expense of others. So those three apply here. And the other that I think is really alive in a place of interpersonal tension is a disciple of Buddha does not harbor ill will. Because sometimes, and again, I would say this is really deepened by dominant culture, when we feel wronged or when someone has said something we disagree with and we feel that agitation, there's a kind of satisfaction in holding on to separation from that person. If this is not something that troubles you, generally you can think about some of people in leadership in our country and think about how it can be a little satisfying to be like, I don't like them, this is harboring ill will. Even, we could maybe find a way to have a healthy boundary with that relationship. But that satisfaction of making that person wrong is harboring ill will. And we have to be in environments, I think, and I would offer that Stone Creek is a place that's ripe for this possibility, where we get to risk trying something different than the habituated separation. And then have the experience of something beneficial happening and not just something bad happening when we call one another in to relationship. It makes me think of how this idea that Sangha is a verb is very akin to how love is a verb. Love's not a feeling. It's not just like a happens. It's how we act. It's how and what we do. Love is an engagement. It's a commitment. Sangha is just like that. It's an engagement. It's a commitment. And it manifests in the world by how we, I never noticed that manifest has man in it. It human-affests in the world. by how we do it, how we live it, how we are it. And here's the real major obstacle, and I want to name it in part because we're all, are not, I can't tell if everybody's in Sonoma County, but most human beings are stressed out right now. Actually, no matter where we are, but if you add the fires to it, we're super stressed out. To be in relationship is unfamiliar, maybe, like it's not our habit energy, and it's effortful. It does take effort. It's quicker and easier to do, again, like just like the addiction pattern, it's quicker and easier to do a separation and be done with it. Like, I don't care, I don't like that person, they're not worth my time, they're dumb, or whatever the thing is that we do to separate, to try to dissipate and disconnect from the relationship. So we do have to have lived experiences of it being beneficial when someone says something harmful, of following them and having that be actually something good comes out of. But I want to offer that it is possible to do if we are grounded when we reach out, and if we are standing in our deep, like, practice intention. There's been a couple times lately so we're doing this 4-month intensive, the Dharma of being anti-racist, in connection with the Access to Zen Sangha, which Reverend Lan Shut leads. And there's been 2 times already that I have, in a small group, said something, and later I'm like, oof, I'm not sure how that landed with that person. It's all on Zoom, so that actually makes it even more fraught in a way, interpersonally. And I've followed up with the person, and it's vulnerable and it's uncomfortable to do it. And both times it's just been so sweet what happens in the following up. Maybe once in my life I can think of where I kind of reached out to follow up with somebody and they were like, no, thank you. That's important. When we reach out to follow up with someone, we reach out and say, I would like to follow up with this. Are you open for that? Are you open? Do you have the energy for that? Because maybe they don't, and right now maybe lots of people don't. And for the most part, my experience is, as I've made that a practice in my life, people say, oh, I appreciate you caring about that. Or yeah, let's find a time. And once someone didn't end, it was painful, but it was also like, okay. I actually felt the trust that person had in our relationship to say, I'm not up for that right now. I wanted to just mention an example from the wider Sangha. And, I was in a meeting where the person who was speaking was a person in power in that situation. And they were reflecting on their own racial acculturation. And it wasn't explicitly a Buddhist environment, but it was a kind of Sangha environment. And they were remembering when they had become aware of racial differences. This was a white identified person, and they had, as a child, had heard the N-word, and they had a friend who was Black. What is that word? And they saw the impact of that word, and the pain that it caused, and it woke them up to the violence of racial division. And when they told the story, they said the N-word in full when they were telling the story, and it's a powerful and violent word. And I noticed it at that time, and I had the thought, I wonder if that person has ever heard the requests by people of color that never say that word, like ever. Just don't say it, even if it's in a song lyric. And this is a discussion that family, because we're around teenagers, so there are lots of song lyrics that have the N word that ends in an A, for the most part, and it's not a universal thing, where people will be like, well, I'm not going to change the words of an artist of color. For the most part, the request is that I've heard in my experience from people of color is, white people, please don't say that word. Just don't say it. And that's not a thing to do to be PC or to get it right. It's a thing to hear and to even internally be in conversation with. Okay, a lot of Black Americans have said, please don't say that word if you're white. So I reached out to this person and said, could we follow up? There's just a thing from the meeting. I wonder if we could follow up. And we had a conversation about it. And it was so, But I was really careful to make sure I was super grounded. I didn't think the person was wrong. I just wondered, I thought this was probably a person who would like to know that that's a request that's out there. I wondered if they knew. And that was the way I entered the conversation. Not that I was offended or that they had done something wrong. And I think that's important, right? I wasn't coming like, I gotta tell you when it all went bad, you know. So we had a conversation and I said, have you ever heard this request? And the person said, I have heard that request. And I noticed that I said the word in full. And they also shared that when the first time as an adult that they shared the story was with a colleague who was a Black American. And I think what they were saying was that she had given them permission to tell the story in full. And that's interesting, right? So to honor that request. But so we just had a conversation. We called each other into this dynamic, and at the end of the conversation, a couple of things happened. One is the other person said, you know, I think that these are the conversations that people want white people to be having. They were excited. And I had the same feeling. We were vitalized by the conversation. And then we both acknowledged that even though we didn't know one another very well, our relationship had begun to develop and we were deepening in relationship. And I wanted to bring that as an example because you know, we need to know that these efforts are worth it. And again, this can feel like, oh, you're just talking about political things or something, but like I would offer that this is literally the work of our practice of liberation. The liberative practice of Sangha is to be with things that are uncomfortable and to call one another into engagement around them. Last week in Cora and Charlie's talk, there was the question of what can we do together as a Sangha? And I would say like, this is something we can do. Or these are a set of things we can do. This is a whole host of things we can do. We can make a practice of grounding in our bodies so that it's so familiar and that we make a habit of it. We replace the habit of lifting off from our bodies and being unaware of our bodies, that we make anchoring in our bodies a habit that brings us into the present, and it makes it more possible for us to show up fully in any given situation. And I would also say that we engage the practice of attending carefully to what's happening with us and then what's happening in relationship. And that when we communicate with one another, we see that as an act of connection and not of competition or aggression or division. And we might, it gets subtle. I think we do have to look. I feel in the couple of years that I've really been focusing on this in my practice, I feel that there are times when my literal intention is to make connection, and what I'm doing is disconnecting. But because the habit of disconnection and separation is so strong in how I've been acculturated, that sometimes, and if I'm really in my body, I can feel the difference. So even though I'm saying so somebody will say something that's challenging that's happened for them, and then I'll offer an anecdote of something similar. My attempt is to connect through oh yeah, that's happened to me too. I can feel in my body, though often that offering is disconnecting, if that makes sense. And I just offer it as a thing to explore. And I think another thing to take heart in is that we can be present. We can be grounded in our body, even in our agitation. So there's a footnote in Reza Memenikin's book where he's talking about being present with agitation, where he says, settled, so he's talking about settled as being grounded in the body and attuning to the body. Settled does not mean unworried or unfrightened. It means that the person's body is able to access its resilience. A human body can be frightened, angry, or filled with dread and settled at the same time. And he goes on to say, I suspect this happens in many heroic acts. So in this time of ongoing kind of chronic agitation and like high levels of agitation and disruption and uncertainty. We don't utilize our practice to try to be something else. We can utilize our practice to be fully here with it. And then to know that when we can be in that place, when we can acknowledge fully the experience of agitation and uncertainty and dread that we may be feeling, it's more possible for us to connect with others in Sangha, meaning the Sangha of all humanity, skillfully and with kindness and with our deep intention actually as one of the possibilities for going forward. In Sangha Is a Verb, Sebene Selesi says, beloved community was a phrase, an idea often used by Dr. Martin Luther King, who went as far as to say that the ultimate aim of the work of the civil rights movement was to foster and create the beloved community in America. He said, our goal is to create the beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a qualitative change in our lives. And he believed relationship as central to creating beloved community. And then he talks about how we meant to start that through changes in policy, but how ultimately beloved community, creating beloved community is a change beyond legislation. And when Sebene Selesi brings it up, she says, in Buddhist Sanghas, what she's talking about in terms of Sangha-ing and creating beloved community is a change beyond meditation. I like that. It's a change beyond personal awakening into creating the potential for liberation in our communities, both our Buddhist communities and all of our communities. This idea that Thich Nhat Hanh offers us of the next Buddha will be Sangha, we can embrace right now. You know, we don't have to wait for Maitreya Buddha to show up. The next Buddha right now, the next Buddha of the Buddha of the next moment can be Sangha, and it can be the way that we open to and call one another in to a more liberative way of engaging with one another. Thank you. So for the question and comment section, if you'd like one possibility, I think this can work because it always gets a little willy-nilly. And I just want to make sure that we're not missing somebody. So if you have a question or you have a comment, you can unmute even before it's your turn. And that way we'll just have a list of people who are wanting to ask something. And then when you're done though with the exchange, you can just remute, and then that lets the next person bump up, if that makes sense. Okay. Are there any thoughts or comments or inquiries or disagreements or any of it?
I have a question for you. I just want to make sure I understand the calling in part. Okay. And Richard, yes. I understand it as acknowledging the interconnection and relationships between people and encouraging a dialogue. Is that what you?
Yes, exactly. So calling in, so calling out is that thing that's like, you know, you've done something bad. Calling in is, I've noticed this tension in me based on something you said. And I wonder if we can be there together in it. What was it? I looked over actually at Cora and Charlie's notes last week, and it didn't make it into what he said out loud, but he had the etymology of the word to converse, which is con is with, and verse is
vertere.
Vertere was turning. So turning with one another. And I think that that's the image, you know, that we're not reaching out to one another to say like, oh, I just have to give you this information at you and then you'll be all fixed, you know. We're reaching out to one another with the idea of, can we turn together? Can you help me turn this? And yes, so thank you, Richard, for helping me that. Yeah, Roberta, I can.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good to see you.
I haven't actually had an opportunity for quite some time, and this feels really uncomfortable, but also natural to be here. I have difficulty doing what you are suggesting, and I see the value in having conversation as opposed to being correct about something and informing someone from that place, because I'm not engaging, but I currently am experiencing, I guess, disappointment, anger, upset over old friends of mine from years ago on Facebook who have not let me know that they're Trump supporters. And it has presented quite a challenge for me. Mostly I end up unfriending them, to tell you the truth. My son suggested that I not do that. Ian said, you know, you could offer something to them by continuing to be a supporter of other than what he represents. So I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about what you just said this morning, because it so hits what I've been working with within myself. And of course, this whole pandemic and fire and my own daughter, Jamana, not finding a shelter with her animals was very painful.
Yeah.
But she ended up staying at her home in Forestville, and everything was fine. She just intuitively made that choice. And I was thinking about that, how we are so separate during this crisis.
Yeah. Maybe that's part of why it's alive for me. Maybe I'm, the physical separation makes me want to think about like how to of not separating. But here's the thought that it was somewhere in my notes, and I'm so glad you brought up these when it's really challenging, Roberta. The first thing is that idea of healthy boundaries internally. So we have to assess like how much do we have available. We have to know that practices are effortful and like and as a act of caretaking, we have to say, I might not be up for this right now. So so there's a way that a friend your friends on Facebook, if that's just all it's going to be is continual agitation and pain. Yeah. And I would offer that we can stay in relationship with people, especially when it's really hard and we're like, no, I don't know about this one, or when there's really been a lot of harm. One thing we can cultivate is metta meditation as the ground of, or as a way of being in a relationship. The person might not know we're still in a relationship necessarily, but we do, and our heart does. You know? So that's a possibility for people that were really like, I just actually can't deal with you interpersonally, but I can, in my heart, I can keep the relationship alive by wishing you well.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, a really, in this time and in times of deep agitation, it's a really powerful practice. It's not metta meditation, I think, is again, like it's very effortful and powerful, not a sentimental practice. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I would offer, to state that that's the way you keep the relationship alive and not get disconnected.
Dojin.
Yes, hi, Judy.
Your talk, fabulous. And I have a similar, I want to follow up on Roberta, because that's what was coming to my mind. The reconciliation of speaking up, which is something that came very powerfully to me after George Floyd was killed, that prior behaviors of sort of just being silent, or the sort of metaphor of unfriending, just didn't feel right to me anymore. And it was sort of like taking a vow not to be silent. And as uncomfortable or disconcerting as it might be, to speak up. And I find myself in a similar situation, Roberta, as that, what you're describing. And it's almost impossible because I'm sort of not a social media person, I don't think, but have gotten into it because of groups I'm in. This one dance class I'm in, it's all online. So anyway, to find people espousing things and making statements, posting conspiracy theory statements, I'm left with a choice of like, let it ride and just don't engage, or to say, that's not true. Which unleashes an enormous waterfall of stuff from not only the person I have this sort of online relationship with, but all their friends. And it's just a continuous choice. And that whole thing about trying to be grounded, I do, and I'm never rude. I don't call names or anything. I just try to bring information, but it's a real fine line with what you're saying about not trying to tell people what's right or put myself in that position or situation with people. It's almost impossible. But the only other alternative is to be silent in this case.
Yeah.
And not speak up and not say that's not true.
It's also striking me how warped of a human connection social media allows, right? Like it's a place where people's the divisiveness is like amplified. Over reductiveness is amplified. Anonymity allows us to behave in horrible ways, right? That we would never say to a person if they were right in front of us. And so I think that those are real limitations of that medium that need to be just like, yeah, there's not a lot, or better yet is like, how can we liberate Facebook, for example? Woo! That's like high level bodhisattva engagement. Let's do it. But I don't know I don't know how yet, because I think, we, except to say that thing of we can cultivate relationship even in our own hearts, So, and if you don't mind trying it as an experiment, Jude, like the next time you read a conspiracy theory that makes you just super mad, like a week of metta meditation for that person in particular, like really focusing on them as a bodhisattva, really, really wanting them to be well, knowing actually that for people to get lost in the delusion of over reductive theories about what's happening is harming them, like they are not benefiting from being like, well, this is all a conspiracy and I know what it is. I mean, it's actually this very, it almost brings like affection into my heart that conspiracy theories are just this attempt to have control in the chaos of the complexity, It's an expression of like, I cannot with the complexity. I'm going to make it really simple. It's that guy, and we can have compassion for that, even if and then from that place, then we can, that's maybe how to write Facebook, from that place of like really cultivating open-heartedness. Now we move toward and say, I don't think this is helpful for me or for you. I would like you to be free from resisting the complexity of reality. I'll word it differently. But I appreciate the engagement and the effort, and I think that's the other thing I want to just keep saying is I think it's worth it. Draw the clear boundaries where we need to, when there's harmful action, and also stay in relationship where we're able to. Thank you.
Dojin, so I have a follow-up question to all of that. It's all related to Roberta and Jude's questions also. For me, initially, I feel that the separation that is not good, like, this is horrible, or this is so ignorant. And I get so upset because it is upsetting. So at that stage, there's nothing, because when I'm hit there's impact, and that's my response. But I just feel that. And then when I'm able to think, that's when I can expand. But initially, oh my God, I'm ready to like strangle Trump for signing, drilling at the Arctic. I mean, things like that. And, how idiotic to say that the California fires are a result of us not sweeping our leaves. It's so annoying. How can you not be annoyed, right? So initially, there's that impact, that annoyance, like I just want to kick him.
Yeah, well, I'm
so
just
that's the initial, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay to feel that, but we don't stay there. Is that okay? Because that's what happens to me.
That's what I was going to say, was I'm just so encouraged that it's so clear to you, the initial thing, because then it, because what you're pointing to is that isn't your whole experience, right?
Right.
In your practice life, you've noticed the initial thing is a knee-jerk separation, which when we look at how we, and we, I mean here, we as people, but also particularly we as people in the United States, and then particularly we as people in dominant culture, the dominant culture impacts, we are taught to separate. So it makes sense that that's the initial boom. And what's so an exciting possibility is that that's not the whole of your experience.
Yes.
You're naming the irritating things, like how about caging children? How about caging children as an act of, a human act? And but the biggest potential for us to bring our practice into engagement and have transformational possibility is if we can ground in our deep intention for all beings to be well before we engage. And it's not like, I would say, in some cases, like what Roberta's bringing up, in some cases, metta meditation might be the whole of what we're able to do. That tension might be too extreme. And again, as much as we can, stay in relationship and bring the heart of the bodhisattva into this culture, into our collective culture, and look at it a different way. Like, will you please look at putting those children in cages in a different way? Can everyone please look at that in a different way? Can we change the view of that being a solution to being like a very big problem? And that we bring the heart of the bodhisattva that requests that, but we do that out of love, the enactment of love.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say something?
Let me just this a sec, Holly, because I just want to check with Brian that you've been unmuted. Are you unmuted on purpose?
Oh.
Maybe not. I just want to see if you were like in line, Brian, or not. Okay, gotcha. Okay, yes, Holly, maybe this is one more. Go ahead.
Yeah, press the thing.
You gotta press the bar. Okay, the only thing following up on all of this is by saying that feeling that they are wrong and what they're saying is sort of invalidating their own experience. And I feel like that's sort of judgmental, because if you think of, put yourself in their shoes, if you want to say it that way, and they're hearing, well, we're going to meditate for you because you're so wrong. Yeah, I mean, that's not helpful for us to think that. So.
Okay, thank you. There's an opportunity for me to clarify. Don't meditate for people because they're wrong. When you're holding that they're wrong, cultivate or ground in the body, or cultivate metta meditation because of the suffering that we are in. We are in the suffering of division. When I'm certain that somebody else is wrong, I am working with my own suffering. Does that make sense? So it's actually a super different emphasis. I'm working with my pain and the tension of my discomfort. When I feel like somebody's wrong, that actually produces quite a bit of tension in my body. And what I'm suggesting is we get really, really intimate. Like, how do you feel that? There's a whole bunch of physical, and it's for each of us, it's different. Human manifestations of tension, that then we're going to need to diffuse, and we do need to diffuse it. We don't want to rock around in that pain, but we want to start, we're working with that pain to begin with, and then we work with that pain enough that we start to remember, oh, that's right, we're in relationship, and oh, that's right, that other person is as complicated as everybody else. And then we to the complexity of what that other person is, and understand that conditions brought them to whatever it is that they said or did. Now the ground is much more solid for skillful possibility. Okay, thank you. Thank you again for that opportunity to clarify. Okay, I think that's it, unless there's one left.
Dojin, could I just one quick thing?
Yes.
Is it part of metta practice that positive, negative, neutral way of working with your practice, where you have an intense, I mean, as a recovering, angry person, it's like the first thing is a negative or an anger, pour gasoline on my own fires, right? But to begin to see that and think, okay, and then work using it, getting at least to a neutral place and in my responses, if you will, and then and then to the positive, and working through, like using it as part of that 3-point practice thing. Is that part of metta, or am I confusing with something else?
This is making me want to do a class on metta meditation, which maybe I will do. The positive, negative, neutral, how you work with it in metta meditation traditionally. We can be creative with these practices as we need to, especially in times of great distress. The idea is you begin with, actually, you're supposed to start with yourself. For many people acculturated in the West, it's really challenging to be kind and like unconditionally love ourselves. So you start with people that you have positive feeling toward. So you generate in your heart the sensation of like people that it's easy for you to love, or better yet, actually you feel toward yourself that feeling of unconditional. You might need to bring to mind somebody who has loved you unconditionally. And then it can also even be for a pet if it's remote, but that feeling of like that unconditional regard and love. So you start with it's easy. And then the practice of metta is then you bring to mind someone neutral. So somebody you don't have any emotional valence about. And then it's like literally challenging the heart. Can I extend that level of intimate, vulnerable love to somebody I don't even know and have no investment in? And that's the effort there. And then from there, you move on to someone who has caused you pain or is difficult. And again, like you don't start with someone who's really, really harmed you. You start with somebody who is mildly irritating. And you try there, and then it's a literal capacity. I actually feel it as a literal physical capacity, like a physical capacity of the heart that we can cultivate if, and that our tradition suggests that we do, that it's from that when we're able to stand in that cultivation, we're able to engage with people more truth, because actually as bodhisattvas, we care about all, not just the nice ones and the good ones. We care about all beings. So that's where metta meditation is really tied with Zen practice. It gives us the capacity to do that, and we can really work on it. But I will, if there's any interest, maybe we'll do a class on metta meditation, because it would be nice to. What's interesting, even though it sounds discursive, something that's super grounded and almost like an antidote to agitation to do metta meditation. So. It's appropriate to our current situation. Yeah, thank you, Susan, and more to come on that. Okay, so this week, just because we haven't done it in a while, I put the Tisarana in the chat, so we can do that as our closing chant, and then we'll have time for announcements after. Tisarana Buddham Saranam Dhammam saranam gacchami. Sangham saranam gacchami. Didyambi buddham saranam gacchami. Didyambi dhammam saranam gacchami. Didyambi sangham saranam gacchami. Tatyambi buddham saranam gacchami. Tatyambi dhammam saranam gacchami. Tatyambi sangham saranam gacchami.